I just wanted to welcome you all in with some music. I love that line, Bob Marley from Trenchtown Rock. He says, "Hit when one good thing about music, when it hits me, I feel okay. One good thing about music, when it hits me, I feel okay." So just a way to kind of invite folks into a space and have it feel a little bit different than maybe a typical session or class. So, we'll talk about how that could relate to what we're talking about today a little bit later on in our session. Yeah, no worries. There's construction outside my window too. Oh my gosh. So yeah. So as we are inviting people to come in, we'd love to invite you all to just put in the chat a really quick intro with your name, obviously, how you want to be addressed, your university, where you're from, maybe what you do there really briefly, and something that brings you joy. So I'll put that in the chat, and then I'll model it with my own. And as we let people come in for the next minute or two, we will see who folks are in the chat. Excited to have you all here.
We plan to use the chat a lot in this session, so feel free to contribute using the microphone or the chat, as however you'd like to participate. Another thing I might ask you to do as we're welcoming everybody in is if you wouldn't mind modifying your name, if you have renaming abilities so that I can see what university you're from, that may help us if our group gets big enough to go into breakout rooms.
Nice. And as you read through other folks's what brings them joy, if you notice any resonances, like just makes me smile, reading what people bring, what brings other people joy.
A lot of love for cats. I got a lot of cat people here today.
Yeah. The water, definitely. Very cool. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? And if other people join as we gather, that's great. Oh, we have another attendee. Welcome. Yeah, Megan, did you want to give our little disclaimer?
So as we're welcoming in and getting settled, I did want to issue a disclaimer that we are recording this session, and this topic, trauma-informed pedagogy, may include some sensitive and uncomfortable things to discuss. And so I just wanted to only invite you to share what you're comfortable sharing and comfortable having recorded. And if we do go into breakout room space, breakout rooms will not be recorded. So that is an opportunity to bring up anything you might without worrying about the recording. And for those who are just arriving, we've invited everyone in the chat or to use the chat to share their name, university, and role and something that brings them joy. And feel free to use the chat throughout this session as well to contribute, or you can mute and unmute if you'd like. Lots of ways to participate today.
Should we start off with our poll?
Let's do it.
All the fun Zoom tools. So check it out. So there were 3 resources we posted on our site. If you, all right. If you accessed any of them, you can choose multiple ones, and please own the I did not do any and I don't feel guilty. We are guilt-free. You're welcome, however you are, whoever you are. Great. All the results are pouring in. So it seems like, yeah, a bunch of folks got to look at the teaching checklist and at some of the articles, and that's fantastic. So feel free as we go forth to share your takeaways and share what you have gotten out of these resources with the rest of us, because it looks like not everyone has looked at every one. So everyone will learn from your takeaways as well along the way. Just gonna end the poll. And Oh, T for Teaching. Yeah, great podcast. Absolutely. So, we are going to introduce you to the shared collaborative Google Doc. So when we talked about, yeah, you're welcome to add things, share things in the chat or in this document. Megan, do you want to pull that up and tell us anything else about that? Um, I'll put the link in the chat.
Sure. So what I believe I'm currently sharing
You are.
is a Google Doc that we call our collaborative notes document for this session. It's an opportunity for you to contribute and use as a working space that you can have both now and as you move forward with implementing trauma-informed pedagogy into your practices. We've got our pre-session resources that we just hinted at in the poll as well, which are also available on our website. And then some action steps that we're going to kind of focus on today, the talking points that we're hoping to facilitate conversation around. But there are sections as well for you to add any additional resources that you may know about on this topic. Lauren, I saw you share T for Teaching in the chat. That is potentially one you could put in there as well if there's a great podcast episode about this topic. And then we also do have room for you to brainstorm a commitment to action based on, whatever inspires you today to implement trauma-informed practices into your student interactions. So the link is available in the chat. Feel free to contribute as much or as little as you'd like today.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, again, hopefully you'll be able to use this as a resource, kind of make our thinking visible and be able to look back on as well as you maybe want to share resources with colleagues or just have this to reference in the future. So just to dive into our topic, and I know that you have this in front of you, but I'm just going to read it out loud because I think it's a great definition of just what trauma-informed pedagogy is, which is a holistic kind of series of approaches to teaching and learning that really recognizes and responds proactively to both the collective and individual traumas that both students and faculty experience in our lives and in this world. So it's underpinned by the neuroscience of learning. It's an approach that really brings heightened awareness of the crucial role of emotion in cognition, of kind of our feelings to our ability to really process and learn and have new ideas, make new meaning. And so trauma-informed teaching practices seek to create classroom communities in which students feel safe and empowered and connected with one another. And thoughtfully promoting both student and faculty well-being fosters deeper engagement and more equitable learning outcomes. So just to briefly introduce what we're talking about with trauma, we went to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA's definition of trauma, which Mays Imad cites in her article, which is an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And so interesting, that Mays Imad points out that, two people could go through the same experience and one person could have trauma, experience it as traumatic, and have lasting effects on them, and another person could not necessarily. So I think that's a very interesting point to think about. So we're also super thrilled today to be collaborating with our colleagues at Wentworth Center for Wellness. Both Maura Mulligan and Amber Goulart are here with us, and I know we actually have a bunch of other, looks like folks who are social workers on the call, so it's an incredible amount of expertise. And just want to turn the floor over to Amber and Maura to just talk a little bit more and introduce us to this idea of trauma and trauma-informed practices. And there's some other ideas that come up around it when we talk about this, like burnout and post-traumatic stress, maybe secondary trauma that teachers might be experiencing. So just want to turn the floor over to y'all and let you, share your perspectives on these things and bring your wisdom to this conversation.
Amber, I don't know if you want to go first. You want me to go? We didn't talk.
Sure. Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about different types of trauma. I think Maura has more perhaps information on trauma-informed practices, but I can talk a little bit about different types of trauma, specifically jumping into secondary vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and burnout. So Trauma, as you had mentioned, right, is the emotional response a person may have related to different distressing experiences. I apologize. I also have people doing sound check for a Pride event today, so that is the background noise that you're experiencing. But depending on the different type of experience, a person may walk away with a form of trauma, and there's different varying degrees of types of experiences that could perhaps lead to this. So something such as an acute trauma, so that is within the immediate aftermath of a one-time situation. And this is something that's typically short duration. So this could perhaps be something like a sexual assault, a car crash, sudden death of a loved one. So these are something that they are the acute traumas or traumatic experiences that one would experience. And then we have something that's called chronic trauma. So this is harmful events that are repeatedly prolonged. So this is perhaps in pervasive ongoing sexual assault, bullying, neglect, domestic violence. So these are ongoing. Then there's something that's complex trauma. So that's multiple complex traumatic events where there's perhaps not an opportunity of an escape. So being trapped is this challenging piece of sense of safety within the world. And then we have what you had mentioned being this secondary or vicarious trauma. And this is where individuals were perhaps being exposed to other individuals suffering. And so this is where people who are caregivers are really at risk for this type of pieces. So perhaps, first responders, law enforcers, or people in the mental health capacity, or if we have people who are really working ongoing within the classroom and really hearing a lot of their students' ongoing challenges, and they're trying to help support them. When somebody has vicarious trauma, over time, they then are put at risk for what's called compassion fatigue. So vicarious trauma is kind of when we are then pulling on a lot of this different types of, we're seeing how it's impacting us. We're feeling a lot of lethargy. We're really having this sense of ongoing, interactions. Compassion fatigue is when we're then feeling this lack of ability to then care for other people because of this worldview. So it's kind of like a next possible step that comes from this. Burnout is something that's separate but can be related. So burnout is then when we're feeling this challenge in our experience, work, home, life, which can come from this separate worldview. The difference between the two is that burnout could perhaps be easily remedied. We are maybe going to have coping skills. We're going to change our jobs. We're going to shift some things in our routine. But compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are things that are more world viewed and ingrained because of these experiences that we've then been exposed to, or we've now had kind of an ongoing mindset because of these challenging experiences. So if I've been exposed to an ongoing vicarious trauma because I've been supporting somebody who's been having a lot of challenges, and now I'm almost outwardly seeking or having this sense that, all other people share this type of experience. So if I'm working with somebody who has had ongoing sexual assault, and I am now aware that this is something that is going on in the school, I might have a heightened alert that there's more assault going on than I was privy to and aware of. This may kind of have this vicarious trauma. As I ongoing more and more am supporting and I'm feeling more like this is taking away that energy, that might decrease my ability to care for the people in my life, my friends. Maybe I'm like, you know what, I can't really hear about this much more because I'm feeling so drained because of this. I'm less likely to be able to be supportive. And then that perhaps leads me to feel these pieces of burnout. So that's kind of where these different aspects and areas of trauma kind of come in and pull pieces and how they're different but related. So I hope that that's perhaps helpful in explaining some of the differences.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And Maura, what do you? I'm sure you wanted to add something too.
Sure. No, I think Amber did. Thank you, Amber. That was a great overview. And I think the checklist you provided, or that checklist, if for people who have not taken a look at that, of one of the the items that was sent to us is, I think, a great starting place to be thinking about sort of then, like, what do you do with that information sort of that Amber provided and talked about in terms of how then you interact in the classroom and how you really think about trauma and its role kind of in teaching and how that impacts the classroom. And I think, some of what you started saying at the beginning, right, like that safety piece and that trust piece, and sort of being mindful of how you think about trying to create a classroom culture that really supports those things, right? So, setting up the class in such a way that you have really clear expectations of when things are due and real clarity, making sure you are providing resources to students. Like if you're having a hard time, sometimes people put that in a syllabus statement or make a statement at the beginning, like if you're struggling, here are the resources, here's what's going on campus or off campus, where you can gain support if you need it. So sort of just voicing that so students know that you are aware that students are not just kind of people coming in to learn, that they have these other things going on and they may be experiencing trauma. And then really being mindful, I think, about what's going on in the world and how that is impacting the students in your classroom, right? So don't want to get super, political on some of these things, but there's been a lot going on in our world, and just not that you need to be talking about that in a math class. So sometimes faculty say, well, how does that, if it doesn't interact, or it doesn't impact them teaching, but that's what students are carrying. So if a student is, if you have a student of color in the classroom and sort of all these things are happening nationally, and there's been a lot of, attention, as there were the last 2 or 3 years, right, to what's going on, being mindful if something big was in the news for them, that they might be triggered by that may not be the day that they're able to concentrate. And we don't want to call them out as someone of color to ask them to speak about that, but just being mindful that there could be trauma there and they may need some flexibility and grace for that. And the same is true for like lots of things. So I think often we think of like, well, these must be big things that impact them, but it doesn't have to, right? So I think even if we think about the fighting happening right in Ukraine right now, you may have students in your classroom, you may say, well, they're not from Ukraine and they're not from Russia, so they must not be impacted by that, right? But is there other traumas they've experienced in their life and that this is sort of bringing up for them and making them more emotionally vulnerable? Or maybe they're from a country where there was some civil unrest. So just sort of being mindful that students are coming in with lots of experiences and often lots of trauma. And so we really just want to think about how we can provide them support and safety and give them the ability to connect with one another, the ability to trust you as a faculty member, right? To sort of be able to talk about things if they want to or not, or be able to say to you, I'm having a really hard time and I need some support, and to sort of know that you'll let them do that without sort of pressuring them too much on that. So I think thinking about that flexibility in the classroom, the connection to peers, right? Like being mindful of what's sidebars and, comments that people may not mean to be harmful in the classroom that can be really harmful to someone with trauma, right? If someone is making an offhanded comment or someone makes a joke about sexual assault or sexual harassment, right? For many people, that can be incredibly triggering if they have a trauma history. So, really kind of setting that tone in your classroom around what's acceptable, what's not. And when people say things that are not appropriate, I think sometimes our instinct is to be like, well, maybe we'll just let that go, or hopefully no one heard that and we can move along. But that really erodes trust for that person who may be traumatized by that. So being mindful of like trying to set the tone of the class ahead of time around trust, but also to recognize when something is happening that may be harmful to someone, and not necessarily having to spend a lot of time on it, but just acknowledging that it's happened and sort of let people know that that's not, okay. And giving students as much autonomy as possible is really helpful too, to have them help make some choices. And I think some of what Amber talked about is for you as faculty, right? On that same thing around not getting burnt out is, how do you, in dealing with all of this in the classroom and trying to show up and teach when you yourselves may be experiencing your own traumas based on what's happening in the world, and trying to care for your students, is how do you make self-care a priority from the beginning, not waiting until it's to the point where you cannot, when burnout's starting to happen, how do you begin to recognize that? And how do you make sure that you're doing a lot of self-care And sometimes that is boundary setting, and that's really important, I think, so often for faculty. And I know Amber talked about that, sort of hearing student stories. And sometimes we're hearing it because, well, they're emailing Saturday and 10 p.m. and you're the only person I feel comfortable talking to. And I don't want to go to a therapist. I'm going to keep coming to you as my professor. And that really is overwhelming for you. And so being able to set those boundaries and be compassionate to students and know where to refer them, but also to set limits on what you can do and know that that's okay to do, because that's really necessary, for the students to be contained about what your role is and where they should be getting help, but also to help you not feel like I'm their savior and I need to be in and managing all of this trauma on my own while also trying to be a teacher. So I don't want to talk for too long. I want to give other people in the room, but just kind of thinking about some of those things, I think is helpful.
Well, thank you very much, Maura. Yeah, you definitely brought a lot and added a lot to the discussion. And just to point out the resources that we have on that collaborative Google Doc, those top 6 kind of strategies or tips that are both in both the checklist and as in the Maze Imad article are featured. So you can refer back to those. Maybe we'll look at them together a little later on, but I really want to also open up the space to everyone in this room just to share some of your takeaways, both from what we've already talked about and what you might have looked at in some of the resources. And as you're thinking about what you might share, I'll just really briefly share one that is stuck with me. And then I'd love to open the floor to you all, which is in the Maze Imad video. She shares that when she was in grad school, she was doing great. She was, cruising and getting A's and reading all the textbooks, and it was amazing, and then all of a sudden the war in Iraq happened and her family's in Iraq, and she'd be reading the textbook and like an hour would go by and she'd be like, what did I just read? These words, I read the words, but I don't know what they said, and she, take a test and all of a sudden do poorly. And she talked to her mom and was like, did I just become stupid? Like, what happened? And it took her years to realize, after studying neuroscience and cognitive science, to be like, oh, I was experiencing trauma and emotional stress. And that was literally physically in my brain, biologically, chemically, keeping me in the way from forming new neural connections and being able to focus on learning because there's other thing going on. And when she was able to, see that, she was able to kind of let go of a lot of this stuff that was really holding on to her identity. And maybe she's not a good student and maybe she doesn't belong in PhD program, whatever. And when she was able to offer that to her students during the pandemic, who were all of a sudden struggling, because there's all these additional stressors and health and family and all this stuff, they took a deep breath and they're like, oh my gosh, I never knew that. I just thought it was me, and actually it's this collective experience that, so many humans experience. It's natural to our way, our lives as humans. So that's the takeaway that I had. But love to open up the floor to you all. What takeaways did you have, or have you had, or are you having right now from our discussion about trauma-informed pedagogies?
I'll jump in here. Really appreciate what you just said, Josh. That definitely spoke to me to a point where, as I was listening to her describe that kind of moment when she was really kind of aware that, the war in Iraq, and then all of a sudden she linked it to this inability to kind of function as a student. And I think about my own students and think about, especially since the pandemic, since 2020, and trying to kind of get them back into, or at least trying to fit them back into our mold of this is the syllabus, this is what's required, and let's move forward. So I feel like the pre-work and this kind of intentional conversation is really timely for me. I think that listening to the 2 women in the video, reading May's piece about the brain and the heart, and just thinking about this idea of how slow and intentional we need to be with some of these students, and just even putting it out there that, there is a schedule, there is a framework, but there's flexibility, and it's respectful, and mutual respect and kind of transparency is really not part of the mold before the pandemic. I'm part of a rigorous PA program. We're literally tossing so much information into students' brains, and to think about the impact of COVID, to think about what types of clinical things happened after the students entered the clinical year during COVID, and the kind of change of students since the pandemic started. And I really think this is so important, this conversation right now in this moment. So I'm really grateful I clicked on registering for this. This is important. I'm in the middle of developing a public health course for the fall. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm going to be rolling to the students, being mindful of what stress they bring, what stress they have in their life, and to kind of create a safe place. So this is really helpful for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing that. Floor is open to anybody else who has any takeaways they'd like to offer from our discussion so far, from what you read or watched beforehand.
Hi, so I'm Kristen. I'm from MassArt. I just wanted to introduce myself and also apologize for my tardiness. I'm the assistant director over in the Counseling and Wellness Center. And Megan, thank you for inviting me to join the group. The conversation has definitely been very rich, just for the pieces that I've come in and heard so far. And I've just been taking notes and trying to think a little bit more about how students have shown up in the classroom. I also adjunct at BU in their School of Social Work. So I have some experience with students who are, working with this pandemic. And I know a lot of folks are familiar with Brene Brown, but I always show her video around sympathy versus empathy, just so that I can make sure that I'm working in a space of empathy and not sympathy. And also when thinking about transparency and what that looks like and how to define that and what flexibility looks like and how to role model that in the classroom has been something really supportive and helpful for me. And also for me just to check in with myself again to make sure I'm not being just sympathetic, because sympathy doesn't help to build resiliency. And that's what is very important about people who experience trauma. I have a substantial amount of experience working in hospitals, working with at Boston Medical Center, seeing folks who've, survived and endured so much. And in my, very fortunate conversations, with folks, whether it's substance use, whether it's, that one-time car accident or ongoing trauma in their life that they've experienced, is this tremendous strength and resiliency. And I think that, in talking to other faculty at MassArt and at BU, I feel like folks have kind of stepped away from that. And I think that for me to be able to push on, even personally in my life, like COVID wasn't the only thing that happened in my life. I'm a Black woman in America who also has, family things and there's race things going on, and there's gender things going on, and all the above. And I'm just gonna pick a few in my head to think about now, so my words will come out. But I have to believe that after all of this, I'm going to be resilient, and I have to carry that and think of that for my students and the students who come in to see me in the counseling center, for my staff. And I have to set up spaces where they'll be able to actually practice that. So I was looking through the checklist just now, and it reminded me a little bit about being in a kindergarten classroom. So I used to work in K through 12 as well. I'm not sure if folks have children or, they're people they take care of that are itty bitty ones, and the importance of creating not just like syllabi that express what constitutes safety in this space at the beginning of the year, but really revisiting it and talking about it, and having folks really define that. Because when folks are dealing with and surviving through and thriving through trauma, the basis is the safety component, and you really modeling that and role modeling all the principles that you're teaching in your course, and you're teaching in any course, frankly, about what's valuable and what you want them to walk away from in this classroom. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say that piece. And again, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this lovely conversation across campuses. I'm fairly new to the colleges of the Fenway, so this is awesome. And it's cool to know that this sort of conversation is happening. Also, the CDC did put out a report about how COVID has impacted higher ed, and has broken it down in too many things. So like, if you're not in a space where you can really engulf like how depressing the world is, or like what young adults are experiencing and going through, probably not a time to read that. But when you can, bits and pieces of it, I think it's good just for you to think about what we're going to walk into this fall. And I'm just gonna put down this video again because I just love it and I watch it all the time. Brene Brown. So just check it out if you haven't seen it yet.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing your perspective and all these great resources with us. And this is the type of thing that type of video, I'll stick the link over in the chat in the shared Google Doc. And I just reposted that link for Alana, who just came into our call. Welcome. And just floor is open again for anybody else who wants to share anything they've been thinking about or takeaways they've been having from the resources or conversation around trauma-informed pedagogy.
So I guess I'll share some, because I sort of have two trains of thought going on at the moment. One is a sort of quicker one around when everything shut down for March 2020, bringing us to that different, if I look at a classroom, there's going to be a broad spread of who's experiencing what and how they choose to deal with it. The thing that's coming to mind is that during that spring semester, I had some folks who were very clearly struggling with things that were going on in terms of how the shutdown happened and where they were expected to go. I actually wasn't at Wentworth at the time, but I also had students who were thanking me for maintaining the structure of the synchronous classroom and the things that we were still looking to try to do with the second half of our semester. And so to me, that comes back to the idea of creating like routines and rituals in our classroom, which can promote that sort of safe feeling. Students know what to expect when they enter your classroom. And sort of maintaining that structure while, somehow on the other side of that spectrum saying, it's okay if you can't handle that structure right now. Saying, I understand, and how can we work with that? And the other thing that connects with that is if we are expecting things to be difficult. And sometimes when we're not expecting things to be difficult, but they end up being anyways. I was teaching in Southern California when the 2016 election happened, and co-teaching a class with a faculty member who was, gay and out in the community, and I sort of went into that next morning going, we're teaching math, but we're just gonna be human here because what else are we gonna do? And when we take that 4 years into the future with the 2020 election, and now it's, now it's both pandemic, Zoom teaching, and another who knows what's going to happen situation, that time we're expecting it. If I can take credit for something, the thing that I take credit for in that week was being very transparent with my students and saying, I would like to push out this exam by a day, but I think it's really important to have this exam done before the turmoil of the election that we're all expecting. And I actually had a student come to me on Zoom, and say, I didn't expect this to matter. I didn't expect this to make a difference, but I am so glad that I am not trying to take an exam right now. And even that in the classroom time came back to sort of not knowing how everybody's going to handle things and the structure and different coping mechanisms, which is that, I did put out a little informal straw poll the day after the election and say, how are you doing? Are you here because you feel like you should be? Are you here because maybe math can be a good distraction right now? And I had a blend of those things. So I don't know. I don't have a nice tidy bow to tie up on this, but I think keeping in mind that people are going to react to those things in different ways and have different levels of trauma around that and have different ways in which they're choosing to cope, whether that's a decision or whether that's this is just how I am right now. Bearing all that in mind is important, and reminding myself there's an election this fall I should probably not schedule exams for.
I can relate to what you said about different reactions, and some prefer to have the opportunity to think about something else, like, let me solve this math problem that is within my realm of control, and I can focus on that instead of these larger sociocultural political issues that I'm terrified of. But then there are some who are not in that headspace as well, and I know I've seen students go back and forth between those, and I felt myself go back and forth between those two states of mind. So that resonated with me.
Thanks, Amber, for starting the conversation in the chat as well. And you're always welcome, everyone, to, if you don't feel like, unmuting and speaking, to put your thoughts in the chat. So that's wonderful. I think it'd be great actually now to give us a few minutes to look at the top 6, those actually 7 strategies. And if you're up for it, I think it would be neat to do it in breakout rooms and actually give y'all about 5 or 6 minutes to have a smaller group in which you can both kind of go through those top 7 strategies in the shared collaborative notes and just talk about how they might apply to your context, your specific context, and then actually take a minute to, if you feel so moved, put something in the kind of commitment or call to action steps thing in the Google Doc, where you can actually say, here's one thing I would do, or I would suggest somebody else do. So Megan, yeah, if you want to open up those rooms, that'd be wonderful. And yeah, if you have to go, no worries. But we'll take about 5 or 6 minutes just to get to know each other a little bit more in the smaller rooms, look at those top strategies, and maybe make a commitment to action. See you in a few minutes. That's awesome.
I'm glad to hear it. And I know that whenever I do a really engaging, discussion, I always want more time in the breakout room. So I hope, as we're welcoming everybody back here, I hope the conversations were evocative and informative, and that ideas are being shared. I apologize for some of the timing and logistics messaging from me, but I didn't want to risk ending a good discussion too early. But with that in mind, trying to be mindful of time, we only have 10 minutes left in our session. And so I would just like to hear some quick summaries of the thoughts that were going on in the rooms. Anything you'd like to share, feel free. And as we're listening to folks, feel free to add your thoughts in the
takeaways or action steps in the collaborative notes if you feel so moved, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah. Maybe this is a less daunting way to do it too. But I'll start with just my recommendation. Is I know this is a big topic and there are lots of nuances to it to explore and keep in mind and consider. And my recommendation with that is just to start small. I subscribe to James Lang's small teaching mentality of what's one small but impactful thing I can do differently, whether it's in my teaching interactions with students or in my colleague interactions to try to support a more healthy and trauma-aware community. So it doesn't have to be all one revolutionary way of modifying your approach, but just, start with one small but meaningful step.
We just had a nice conversation really around sort of finding that balance, which I think was part of what was going on in the chat before we broke off as well, which I think was nice, that sort of being flexible and accommodating and mindful of the trauma that our students may be experiencing. And then also though having, from a classroom perspective, right, like academic integrity and fundamentals of a class that need to be taught, and sort of balancing that and having students understand like there can be flexibility and we want to do this for you and recognize that your trauma and what you need to do to take care of yourself. And we need you to be present sometimes and learn. I thought like that balance of both, I think it's hard.
Lauren shared in our group a great idea about putting a statement about inclusivity in the syllabus, so that even though students may not necessarily read it, but it certainly is a starting point to put some language that says, and again, she may have borrowed from another colleague, but made it her own. But I think putting language and then reviewing the syllabus at the beginning of the year, it puts you out there. And I think that kind of language can be really helpful when students are kind of navigating, well, who can I tell this to, or where do I go for help, or whatever I'm struggling with. And I think that kind of a statement is really powerful. So I'm going to be taking that back and adding that to my syllabus. Thank you, Lauren.
I'm excited to hear that too. And that fits with some of the work I've been doing with a couple colleagues here at Wentworth to try to get a more inclusive syllabus template drafted that we can share with faculty. So there's placeholder language for DEI statements, but also the opportunity for instructors to interpret what that means to them personally and create that, that safety and trust within the syllabus itself at the beginning of the course. I like Lucy, the idea that she just shared in the chat of asking students to generate the resources and tactics. And that's a great way to help knock out the sense of overwhelming with it and give some autonomy and agency back to the students, challenging them to ask what works for them, what support systems help me grow, and how can I share that with others. So that's a great thing to remember of, you don't have to do all the work alone. This is a collaborative effort with your students in some ways.
I think that really speaks to some of the steps that, number 3, peer support, and number 4, promote collaboration and power sharing, empowering voice and choice. So some of these strategies, explicitly tie into these larger themes. And I'll just share the one I put down on the action steps one, which I tried to experiment with at the beginning of our session today. So kind of having each, if we were on Zoom or if we're in classroom, having each session maybe a couple minutes early start with music, and students can choose it, and there's people can sign up for it and share music that they love and kind of get to know each other that way. And also, I just love that quote. Literally in that song I shared, it says, one good thing about music, when it hits you, you feel okay. So that it just kind of creates a different space. And we tend to think about trauma-informed things as kind of heavy, and it doesn't have to be. A trauma-informed practice could just be a way to bring more joy into the classroom, bring more lightness, bring more humanity in, and that's kind of what we tried to do in the chat too. It's something that brings you joy. So it doesn't always have to be about confronting the darkness. It can be about bringing more connection, humanity, and light into interactions. Any other thoughts that people had, and what did you talk about in your groups, or other takeaways you're taking from this session?
One thing that Tess and I mentioned that we both do is that at the start of our, because I'm also an adjunct faculty member at another institute, is that we both start off our first class by reviewing objectives and expectations, and we have the class all together kind of set class expectations. So that way later on, if somebody is not kind of going by what they've all agreed to, so if somebody is making a statement that could perhaps be distressing for another student, it's not necessarily like I'm making this call out to you because it's something I disagree with. We as a class have already agreed that this is not something that we'll stand for as a community, and you're not setting what our goals and experiences were planned to. So if you can't abide by what our expectations are, then you perhaps need to leave the class or need to reset your standards and experience. And what Tess does that I think is great is that Tess does a check-in in the middle of the year as well to say, like, are these goals and expectations for conduct and planning still make sense? So that's kind of touching a little bit on that safety piece is why the reason why we do so that way everybody is feeling like the classroom structure and setup is one that everybody is going to feel comfortable in because they've all agreed upon what the plans are for the year in the classroom.
That's fantastic. Great strategy. Anyone else? I think we have time for another one. If anyone else has something they want to share, either in the chat or out loud.
Gratitude for the conversation and the resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tess. And thanks, Lucy, for throwing that in there. I love that. Being the change you want to see. So kind of looking back at your experience as a student and reflecting on what worked well, maybe what could have been better, and bringing that into your classroom. I'll just wrap up with a couple of quotes from the articles that really jumped out to me. One is from Bell Hooks in Mays Ahmad's article. So Bell Hooks argues for us to make the classroom a place that is life-sustaining and mind-expanding, a place of liberating mutuality, where teacher and student together work in partnership. And Mays Ahmad describes a classroom like that as a learning sanctuary. She talks about her job as cultivating a learning sanctuary. So very beautiful, poetic language, evocative. And then in our last resource, Karen Costa, who puts together the checklist, she puts it very simply. She says, take care of yourself and take care of each other. So love to just leave you all with that. Take care of yourself, take care of each other, and stay connected. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and feel free to be in touch at any time. Megan and I will stay behind on the Zoom if anyone wants to hang out with us and chat after the session officially ends. But if you're unable to do so or just want to go on to the rest of your day, we just hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.